We often talk about checks and balances, the different branches of government, keeping each other in line.
Right.
But what happens when that system, well, seems to hit a real snag? We're seeing something unfold right now,
Hmm.
involves a Supreme Court order.
Yeah.
And it looks like it might be facing a direct defiance.
Yeah.
Raises some pretty fundamental questions, I think.
It really does. And this whole situation revolves around a specific person, Abrego Garcia. He's a young man deported to El Salvador under the Trump administration.
Okay.
And the legal path his case has taken, well, it's now at the very top, the Supreme Court. And what's happening now is pretty striking.
So for anyone just catching up, maybe tell us a bit more. Who is Abrego Garcia, and what's the central conflict here that's pulled the Supreme Court in?
Right.
Our plan for this deep dive really is to try and get our heads around the legal side, the constitutional side, what's happening. We're mainly leaning on Glenn Kirshner's analysis here to sort of make sense of it. It feels like a potentially big moment for the rule of law in the U.S. Let's try and unpack it together.
Okay, so the absolute core of this is a Supreme Court ruling. And it wasn't vague at all.
No ambiguity.
None. They found that the Trump administration's deportation of Mr. Abrego Garcia wasn't just like a procedural mistake. They said it was improper, legally speaking, and this is the key part, unconstitutional.
Wow. Okay. So unconstitutional, that's the Supreme Court using its heaviest language,
Yes.
right? Suggests a really serious flaw in what happened originally.
Exactly. It's not a term they throw around lightly.
And they didn't just say, oops, mistake, did they?
Mm.
They actually told the administration to do something.
They absolutely did. The court ordered the administration, well, the previous administration technically, but the order stands to actively work to get Mr. Abrego Garcia released from custody down in El Salvador.
Actively work to get him released. Okay.
Yeah, and the instruction was crystal clear. His case needs to be treated now as if that improper, unconstitutional deportation just never happened.
Like hitting rewind.
Pretty much. And importantly, the Supreme Court specifically mentioned that the original order from the lower court judge, Judge Shines, that order remains fully in effect.
So the highest court has spoken. A clear directive. You'd kind of assume that settles it, wouldn't you?
You would think so.
But this is where it gets, well, complicated and frankly, pretty concerning. There are these reports coming out about a meeting between former President Trump and El Salvador's current president, Nayib Bukele.
Mm.
And what was said after that meeting seems to throw this whole Supreme Court order into question.
It does. President Bukele, he made a statement to reporters, and Donald Trump was actually standing right there with him.
Okay. What did he say?
He said, quite plainly, according to the reports, that he would not be returning Mr. Abrego Garcia to the United States.
Just flat out said no.
Seems like it. And the way he put it was quite loaded. He apparently asked this rhetorical question about, smuggling him into the United States.
Smuggling him.
And then added something like, he wasn't very fond of releasing terrorists.
Whoa, okay. Terrorists. That's a really strong word to use, especially given what we know, or maybe don't know, about Mr. Abrego Garcia's record.
And that's the crucial point. It's a stark contrast with the actual court filings and the official record.
Right. What does the record say?
According to all the court documents available, Mr. Abrego Garcia has never, ever been charged with any crime. Not in the U.S., not in El Salvador, zero charges.
Never charged with anything.
Correct. And what's more, officials within the U.S. Justice Department themselves have actually acknowledged that deporting him was a mistake in the first place.
The DOJ admitted it was wrong.
Yes. They specifically pointed to a 2019 order from an immigration judge that should have stopped him from being removed. So the government itself knew, or at least acknowledged later, it shouldn't have happened.
So calling him a terrorist seems, well, completely baseless, according to the facts we have.
Based on the public record, absolutely.
And Trump's reaction, standing there while Bukele says this.
Yeah.
Did he push back? Did he correct the record about Garcia not being charged?
No. Reports indicate the opposite, actually. Mr. Trump apparently expressed agreement with President Bukele.
Agreed with not sending him back.
Agreed with the stance, yeah. And reportedly added comments suggesting that reporters pushing for Garcia's return are sick people wanting criminals released.
Sick people.
Wow. And he also apparently said something about wanting El Salvador to take in as many criminals as possible from the U.S.
This is troubling. I mean, you've got these statements being made, potentially mischaracterizing someone who hasn't been charged with anything.
Right.
And doing so in apparent defiance of a Supreme Court order with agreement from a former president. It touches on really basic ideas like due process, presumption of innocence.
Absolutely. And it directly challenges that fundamental principle of judicial review, doesn't it? The idea that the Supreme Court gets to say what the Constitution means and whether the executive branch is following it.
If the executive can just sort of shrug off a Supreme Court ruling.
It fundamentally changes the game.
And then there's another layer to this. Professor Timothy Snyder. He's a historian, right? Expert on authoritarianism.
That's him. Highly respected historian at Yale, studies exactly these kinds of issues, autocracy, tyranny.
Okay, so what did he add?
Well, he posted something quite alarming. He claimed that in that same meeting between Trump and Bukele, Trump told Bukele something like, homegrowns are next.
Homegrowns, meaning?
Snyder interprets that and claimed Trump also said El Salvador would need to build about 5 more places, presumably to hold American citizens.
Wait, hold American citizens in El Salvador?
That's Snyder's claim. He interpreted the alleged comments as Trump proposing to deport actual American citizens to foreign camps, basically.
Deporting Americans. He called them concentration camps.
That was Snyder's term for it, yes. He labeled the alleged proposal autocratic, dictatorial, tyrannical. It's a very, very serious allegation based on what he says he learned.
That is, honestly, it's chilling to even contemplate. The idea of U.S. citizens being sent away like that, it feels like completely uncharted waters if that's being discussed at high levels.
It certainly pushes boundaries far beyond accepted norms or, frankly, legality.
So, okay, bringing it back to the immediate legal situation. Where does this stand now? Judge Shines, the trial judge, is holding a hearing. What's that about?
Yes. Judge Shines scheduled a hearing. And the likely focus, based on the context, is to discuss potentially starting contempt of court proceedings.
Contempt of court.
Contempt.
Against whom? The administration.
That would be the implication, yes. For potentially ignoring the court's order, which was affirmed by the Supreme Court. Think about that, a federal judge considering holding the executive branch in contempt over refusal to follow a Supreme Court directive.
It shows how serious this is. Because fundamentally, it feels like a clash of branches, right? The executive branch seeming to say, we don't have to listen to the judicial branch.
That's exactly the constitutional crisis it points towards. The entire structure relies on the judiciary, ultimately the Supreme Court, having the authority to interpret the law and the Constitution, and the executive branch abiding by those interpretations.
That's Marbury v. Madison 101, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. If the executive can ignore the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, well, what does the rule of law even mean at that point? What prevents overreach?
It feels like the whole system is being stress tested right now. If this defiance, this apparent defiance, is allowed to stand, what happens next? What kind of precedent does that set? It's clearly bigger than just Mr. Abrego Garcia's case now.
Oh, much bigger. The implications are enormous. If the Supreme Court's authority isn't upheld here, it could signal potentially that the executive branch could detain people without a clear legal basis. Deny them due process, the right to know why you're being held, the right to argue your case in court, and maybe even ship people off to other countries without any real legal way to fight it.
So those constitutional guarantees we rely on, they'd be weakened.
Severely undermined. That guarantee of due process, notice, and an opportunity to be heard is fundamental.
Glenn Kirshner, whose analysis we mentioned, he put it pretty starkly. He called this a battle for the soul of America.
That sounds dramatic, but when you consider the fundamental principles at stake...
Yeah, it doesn't seem like hyperbole, does it?
Not really. Kirshner's view, and many legal experts would likely agree, is that the Supreme Court simply cannot let this lie. They can't let their order be ignored.
Why not? What's at stake for the court itself?
Their own legitimacy. The entire power of the judiciary rests on its rulings being respected and enforced. If they issue an order and it's openly defied without consequence, their authority evaporates.
So Kirshner expects this will end up back at the Supreme Court.
That seems highly likely, yes. He anticipates the case will return to them.
And what could the court even do then? If, say, the executive branch just digs in its heels?
Well, the court has tools, theoretically. Contempt findings can lead to sanctions, fines. In extreme historical cases, there have been confrontations, though usually compliance eventually happens. But ultimately, the power relies on the acceptance of their authority within the system. A direct, sustained refusal would be almost unprecedented in modern times.
Kirshner wrapped up his take by saying he hopes the American Republic survives this. It really feels like that level of seriousness is warranted here.
It does feel like a critical moment. The specifics are about Mr. Abrego Garcia, and that's deeply concerning for him as an individual.
Of course.
But it's ballooned into this much larger test of our basic constitutional setup, the balance of power, the rule of law.
Okay, let's just try to summarize the core conflict here. We've got a Supreme Court order, unequivocal. It says Kilmar Abrego Garcia was deported improperly, unconstitutionally, and must be brought back, essentially.
Correct. Handle his case like he was never deported.
Then we have public statements from a former U.S. president and the current president of El Salvador, strongly suggesting that order will be ignored. Ignored based on claims about Garcia that seem factually incorrect, according to court records.
Yes, that's the defiance part.
And wrapped up in all this are these deeply disturbing allegations from Professor Snyder about potential plans for deporting U.S. citizens.
Adding another very concerning dimension.
And the result is this potential constitutional showdown with a lower court judge considering contempt charges and the very authority of the Supreme Court seemingly on the line.
That's the crux of it. If the highest court's rulings can just be disregarded by the executive branch, it really shakes the foundations of how the U.S. government is supposed to work. It undermines the whole concept of a nation governed by laws, not by individuals.
It leaves you with some heavy thoughts, doesn't it? I mean, what does it signify for a country that prides itself on the rule of law when figures in power seem willing to just bypass the highest court? What are the ripples long term for individual rights, for that balance of power we talked about, for just the overall health of our democratic system? This situation, this specific case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, it's clearly about so much more than one person now. It feels like a really critical moment to watch.
Absolutely. It's a story that's definitely still developing, and the outcome could have really significant consequences.